Thank you very much. Thanks for the welcome, the introduction, and the chance to be here at the NRA convention in St. Louis. I have had an opportunity to listen to a lot of the other speakers, and each one of them inspired me in their own way. And I would submit this is what comes to my mind, and that is we really haven't very well answered the question of why we have the Second Amendment today. We all know, but we haven't answered it very well. Our founding fathers laid it in there for the reasons that I'm going to get to. But first, I want to tell you that we don't have the Second Amendment, our right to keep and bear arms, in order to have guns for a target. We don't have the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms in order to have guns for hunting. And we don't have the Second Amendment for self-defense among people that might threaten us. Those are all residual benefits that flow from the real reason why we have the Second Amendment, and that's to protect us from tyranny. And that benefit that protects us from tyranny, our founding fathers understood the threat because that threat lived among them. And they wanted to eradicate the threat and wanted a well-regulated militia, and they knew that we could not defend ourselves adequately if we didn't have a populace that was armed, that was proficient, that utilized our Second Amendment. And our Constitution would be defined away by now if we didn't exercise our rights. Think what would happen if somehow we gave lip service to freedom of speech by saying we have that right but didn't exercise it. Think what would happen if freedom of religion, we said we have it, but we didn't worship freely. What if we never freely assembled to petition the government for redress of grievances? Sooner or later, the leftists in the world, the liberals in the world, would redefine our constitutional rights away from us if we fail to exercise them. That's why it's so important that you're here today. It's important that you raise your children and we all raise our grandchildren and future generations, not just to understand the Constitution, not just to understand the Second Amendment that's there to protect us from tyranny, but we raise them to exercise our Second Amendment rights so they're connected, so that they live and breathe and feel that obligation. And I will tell you that I look back on our generations in my family, and I have the .410 shotgun that I learned to shoot with that my grandmother shot prairie chickens with. My father bought a brand new .870 Remington Wingmaster in 1951 and carried that out to the duck blind and me out to the duck blind when I was 2 years old, to make sure that I grew up with a deep tradition for the outdoors and a respect and a love for firearms. And that shotgun today is in my possession, new reblued, new refinished, and it has my father's name inscribed on the receiver, and it will be an heirloom for coming generations. That's how you defend the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. You do it every day. You do it in ways around the coffee shop. You go to the field. You go to the shooting range. You go up there and you pick up your guns and you clean them lovingly and you put them back in the rack again. Because it's part of American tradition. It's a part of defending against tyranny and other things that we get to do. For example, in my role in life, I get to support legislation that defends our Second Amendment rights. And today, I can tell you that in Congress, we have passed out of the House the National Right to Carry legislation, which is H.R. 822. That's the reciprocity legislation that would allow you to take a little card like, I'm sure it's in here somewhere, like this, your concealed weapon permit, and go from state to state. As long as you're in compliance with the laws within your state, it gives you reciprocity. That's something that should have been done a long time ago. It needs to pass the Senate. Our NRA is pushing it, and we will eventually get that done, I think, with the next president. And when I think of the oath to the Constitution that the president takes, I think that many of us have taken an oath to the Constitution. Among those folks are Senator Chuck Grassley. Now, Chuck Grassley and I have both taken that same oath to the Constitution. He's done it over and over again. He is my senior senator. He's a pretty nimble guy. He gets out there on Twitter on a regular basis. If you want to know what he's doing, you follow his Twitter account, and I'll know when he mows the lawn or refuses to do so. I'll know when he picks up some pop cans along the road to clean up the litter, and I'll know also when he doesn't agree with the president, for example, on the president's analysis of whether the Supreme Court has anything to say about the Constitution itself. And I don't know how you put that when you think of a president who's critical of the Supreme Court trying to maneuver a different decision out of the Supreme Court, when you want to disagree with the president and reference the ex-constitutional law professor from the University of Chicago. That's the president. I might have put something like ex-con law professor, but Chuck Grassley would be a little more discreet than that on my Twitter account. And he's also the #1 lead on whistleblowers here in America. He's introduced the whistleblower legislation, and when I look at what has been saved the taxpayer, it's at least $28 billion back into the Treasury because of the whistleblower legislation that Chuck Grassley advanced. And when you're the lead on the whistleblowers in America, he does a lot of research on his own. I can tell you by the lap full of Wall Street journals that'll be on him when he's traveling from town to town in Iowa. But also, he's the magnet for the kind of intelligence necessary to uncover these kind of issues like Fast and Furious. And we might not know about Fast and Furious if it weren't for Chuck Grassley. And we know that he is a direct and honest and frugal and constitutionalist that every day goes out to serve Americans, not just Iowans, Americans. And when he wrote the letter to the Department of Justice to ask about Fast and Furious, and they said it wasn't happening, there was no gun running, gun walking going on. It didn't take him very long to push in there a little harder, and today we have a national scandal that reaches as far up as Eric Holder himself at the Attorney General's office, who refuses to answer direct questions that are asked of him. So I will tell you that I've known Senator Grassley for a long time, and he has been my senator for a good long time. He goes to all 99 counties in Iowa every year. He remembers where he went, what he said, and what you say to him. And he's here today to speak to you. But I'm glad that I can introduce my senior senator from Iowa, Senator Chuck Grassley.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I appreciate serving with Congressman King. Fellow patriots, it's a great honor for me to be with you here today, and particularly with my good friends from Iowa who are here, and of course Kane Robinson, an Iowan who's an officer in your organization. I'm here today to tell you that federal bureaucrats are the greatest threat to our freedoms. We all know that freedom is not free. It takes diligence and hard work to maintain our freedom. The Constitution provides protection from the government to ensure individual liberty, and most importantly, the Second Amendment. As Americans, we must do the hard work to ensure that individual liberties, like the Second Amendment, are preserved, are strengthened, and unabridged. The American experiment, as envisioned by our founding fathers, is about ordered liberty. Ordered liberty requires respect for constituted authorities and the rule of law. The founders recognized the importance of due process, the rule of law, and self-government in preserving our liberty. That's why the right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental individual right, period. George Mason, the co-author of the Second Amendment, once said, quote, "To disarm the people is the best and most effective way to enslave them." I agree, and I know you agree. I've co-sponsored numerous bills that support the Second Amendment, respecting states' rights and Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, the Veterans Second Amendment Protection Act. I also authored an amendment to the health care reform which prevented and will prevent the federal government from collecting data on guns and ammunition. Of course, the health care law is flawed, but we were able to ensure that it didn't infringe on the Second Amendment rights. In 2008 and 2009, I signed amicus briefs in the landmark cases of District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago, affirming that gun control laws violate the Constitution. Of course, they show just how fragile our Second Amendment rights are. It highlights the importance of vetting every nominee for courts to ensure that they support the Second Amendment. Thomas Jefferson once said that, quote, "The greatest danger to American freedom is a government that ignores the Constitution." Now, politicians and bureaucrats prefer to talk about anything but the Constitution, because you know what that Constitution does? It places inconvenient restrictions on their ability to concentrate more power in government. They even blame the Second Amendment for their own failure to enforce law. The gun grabbers in our government exploit any examples of lawlessness and violence as an excuse to infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens. That's why the Second Amendment defenders are often the most outspoken advocates for law and order. It's hard to imagine a more dangerous threat to liberty than blaming our constitutional rights for violence and bloodshed. Yet, that's been tried repeatedly, as you know, during my investigation of the ATF. My investigation began when I took over as ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. ATF whistleblowers told my office a story that seems too outrageous to believe. They said the government was intentionally allowing straw buyers to transfer guns to Mexican cartels. I received an internal ATF document from confidential sources that supported the story of whistleblowers. The dealers who sold the guns were cooperating with the government. The dealers had expressed concerns to the ATF about the dangers of selling to straw buyers. The ATF and the U.S. Attorney's Office had urged the dealers to keep on selling anyway. Tragically, 2 of those guns out of 2,000 were found at the scene of the murder of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry. So, I sent a letter asking the ATF if there was any truth to the allegations. I indicated that I had documents backing up those allegations. Now, amazingly, the Justice Department responded with a flat-out letter of denial. Now, I responded, as you would expect me to, attaching some of the documents that I had gotten clandestinely. I asked the department how to square its denial with the evidence that I presented. Now, that's when the stonewalling started. But I promised the family of Brian Terry that I'd do everything possible to get to the bottom of it. As you heard Chairman Issa speak today, thank God he joined us in that investigation soon afterwards. After 2 subpoenas from Issa's committee to the Justice Department and dozens of witnesses of interviews, we have learned a lot. This is despite the Justice Department opposing and undermining our work. And I'll give you an example, and it's a quantifiable example. You know what? The department provided 80,000 pages of documents that we want to the Inspector General, but they provided only 6,000 pages to Congress, and Congress is doing nothing more than what the Constitution requires us to do, to be a check on the executive branch. There are 2 subpoenas from Chairman Iss's committee. Those subpoenas make the department legally obligated to comply. It's not optional. Instead of providing the documents, the department denied and stonewalled for 10 months. Then the department finally withdrew its denial letter, citing quote unquote inaccuracies. In other words, the Justice Department lied to us. It was a major victory for those whistleblowers that had come forward, and for the truth that these whistleblowers so bravely revealed. Holder himself admitted that Fast and Furious was, in his words, fundamentally flawed. Well, obviously, that's very much an understatement. Let me explain some less understood facts of Fast and Furious. It was not a botched operation. It was not an undercover operation. It was not a sting. Simple fact, Fast and Furious was built on a strategic decision to gather information rather than to enforce the law. It was the direct result of a policy decision to wait and to watch criminals break the law for months on end, rather than to disrupt the illegal activity. Why? All in the service of making a big headline-grabbing case. Well, they got the headlines, but not the kind of headlines that they wanted. Tragically, the headlines involved the death of this brave federal agent, Terry. Amazingly, Agent Terry's death was exactly what was feared by the very gun dealers 6 months earlier, as they warned the Justice Department. In an email to ATF, the leaders expressed concern that his cooperation, that dealer's cooperation might get someone killed. Now, you know, ATF said, well, don't worry, just keep selling. Defenders of this case point to so-called weak gun laws as a real culprit. They claim that the Justice Department was powerless to stop the crime going on right under their very nose. They fail to point out that straw purchasing is already a crime. It's a felony when somebody buys a firearm for someone else and lies on the forms. Whenever someone agrees to pay a straw buyer to lie on that form, that's even a separate crime, a crime of conspiracy. Whoever intends to export the guns without a license is guilty of yet another felony, and all are punishable with heavy fines and jail time. So there are laws to deal with this problem. And, of course, any law-abiding gun dealer is going to notice when a suspicious character nervously puts down $30,000 in cash to purchase guns. In this case, the dealer suspected something wasn't right with some people who repeatedly bought guns. ATF had a cooperating relationship with those dealers. The cooperation, however, only went one direction. The dealers helped the ATF by providing information on the suspicious buyers. However, the bureaucrats at ATF knew much more than they told the dealers about. A Drug Enforcement Administration wiretap in another case revealed who was providing cash to the ringleaders of the straw buyers. The DEA already had a tape discussions about the price of guns and delivery across the border. It also enlisted the U.S. Attorney's Office to help convince dealers to keep selling. But the ATF kept gun dealers in the dark about what it knew from the DEA wire. The gun stores were told that their cooperation was necessary to get to the bottom of the ATF case. Without that assurance, dealers would have stopped making the suspicious sales. But gun dealers depend on the ATF for their license and, of course, their livelihood. So when an ATF asks for help, there isn't much choice for the gun dealer but to cooperate. Now, the ATF assured the gun stores that it was taking care of everything on its end. But what was really happening? They could have used the information to stop the bad guys right now. Instead, ATF let the straw buying ring operate and grow for months and months yet. This isn't just my after-the-effect opinion about what happened. It was a conscious strategy in this case. It was written down, in fact, it was written down in a briefing paper that was going to the Deputy Attorney General. It said, quote, "Currently, our strategy is to allow the transfers of arms to continue to take place to co-conspirators who would continue to operate and illegally traffic firearms to Mexico," end of quote. Now, that's not the end of the briefing paper. It also talked about the ATF's effort to, quote, "slow down the pace of these firearm purchasers," end of quote. However, it also noted that those efforts would, quote, "continue, but not to the detriment of a larger goal of the investigation." ATF supervisors and the U.S. Attorney repeatedly used this excuse of, quote, "protecting the larger investigation." They didn't want to take action to disrupt and deter the straw buyers, but the whistleblowers wanted to disrupt and deter. Instead, the whistleblowers were ordered to just watch and wait. ATF identified over 60 individuals associated with the purchasing ring. The ringleader was known not late in the game, but from the very beginning. Those straw buyers spent over $1 million in cash. 15 of them bought over 1,300 guns, and it was all after ATF started its surveillance. With the kind of information the gun stores were voluntarily giving the ATF, there was no reason for these guns to have walked in the first place. Ironically, the government has tried to use Fast and Furious as a justification for more gun control, or in this case, more reporting requirements. In fact, the cooperating gun dealers were given the ATF all of the entire information that ATF needed to identify and stop these buyers. However, for over a year, ATF failed to arrest them. The ATF knew one buyer, one straw purchaser, bought over 660 guns, paid for in cash. That was after ATF started watching him. That was after the ATF knew that he was working with the leader of the buying ring. That was after the ATF knew that he previously transferred weapons to other traffickers. It's clear that the ATF had every opportunity to stop the flow of weapons long before ATF did. For some reason, they decided to keep it going. A government then that is unwilling or unable to enforce the law is the biggest threat liberty faces. An inept and ineffectual government always asks for more power and for more money. Bureaucrats always have an excuse for why it wasn't their fault. But new laws will never make a difference if the government refuses to enforce existing laws. ATF and Justice Department are too focused on justifying more regulatory authority over guns. These gun stores voluntarily cooperated with the ATF out of a patriotic duty and an obligation to do what was right and what they thought was told by their government was right. Despite the cooperation, someone at ATF apparently leaked trace data to the press. That data unfairly tainted some of those very same cooperating dealers. The data implied that these dealers put profit ahead of public safety. Of course, in this leak, the ATF left out the part of the story about its own role in encouraging the sale to help with some big investigation. That brings me to another major threat to our liberty: misinformation. We like to think that the truth will eventually win out, but as the old saying goes, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. So it takes hard work to get the facts out. This administration likes to toss around statistics about how many guns in Mexico came from the United States as an excuse for more gun control legislation. In 2009, they claimed that 90% of the guns in Mexico were from the United States. Then last year, the claim shrunk to 70% of the guns submitted by the Mexican government for tracing. So you can ask, what are the real numbers? In June 2011, I sent a letter to then ATF Acting Director Melson, pointing to solid evidence that even the lower 70% number is very exaggerated. First, there are tens of thousands of guns confiscated at crimes annually across the river in Mexico. However, only a portion of the guns recovered in Mexico are actually submitted to our country for tracing. The truth is that Mexico only sends the guns they expect to trace back here. ATF has acknowledged that the 70% number was generated using the U.S. source firearms. That definition includes guns manufactured in the United States or imported through the United States. So that 70% number doesn't mean that those guns were purchased at the U.S. stores and then smuggled across the border, as this administration would like to have you believe. The number of guns actually traced to an American gun dealer were shockingly low by comparison to that wild claim of 90%. For 2009, only 25% of those guns Mexico submitted to the United States for tracing were sourced to an American dealer. The misleading rhetoric used by the Obama administration to argue for more onerous gun laws aimed at law-abiding citizens is a threat to individual liberty. It diverts attention from the real issues putting criminals behind bars. So, how do we defend against these threats from this bureaucracy? What do we do with a government that doesn't enforce laws? The answer is Congress doing a better job of oversight. The Founding Fathers envisioned checks and balances among the branches of government in order to preserve freedom. We have the tools to get the facts and to shine light on what the executive branch is doing. If we're afraid to demand answers to tough questions, then we are not doing our job. If we accept the spin, the talking points, and the stonewalling without digging deeper, we aren't doing our job. Consider if we had stopped digging on Fast and Furious when I first received the Justice Department's denial letter the first time. Then where would we be? We wouldn't know what we know now. By continuing to dig, we know that the failure to stop illegal gun trafficking has nothing to do with a lack of information. The ATF knew exactly who the bad guys were, and they knew their activity. So more reporting requirements are not the answer. And when I started my investigation of Fast and Furious, I had three goals. One, to get answers for the Terry family. They still do not know. Two, to hold accountable the highest ranking person in government who knew that the federal government was walking guns and get them fired. And three, to make sure that this stupid program like this never happens again. After 14 months and still going, I've come to a couple conclusions. First, Lanny Brewer, the Assistant Attorney General, has to go for lying. As the head of the criminal division, he knew that government had walked guns long before he admitted it publicly before our committee. He did nothing to hold anybody accountable. He kept quiet as the gun walking controversy grew. He received drafts of that letter to me, the one denying that the ATF ever walked guns. Then he claimed that he had not reviewed the letter when we got plenty of evidence that proves otherwise. He needs to take responsibility for his part. My second conclusion is that either Eric Holder isn't doing his job or his staff isn't serving the Attorney General very well. The Justice Department is refusing to comply with the House subpoenas. The Attorney General is facing a real test of leadership. He has a choice to make. He can force the department to come clean before the House brings contempt charges to enforce its subpoenas, or he can keep ignoring the subpoenas and force a high-stakes political conflict between the legislative and executive branches of government. Now, it's past time to hold accountable these public officials responsible for our own government's role in walking guns to criminals. The family of Agent Terry can rest assured that I will keep doing my constitutional duty of oversight to get answers for them. I will also keep pushing for transparency throughout government. Everyone should see the truth about what has been going on here for the last 2 or 3 years before we started our investigation. It puts people in a position to defend their rights. Our republic depends upon oversight, on transparency, and accountability in government that comes with oversight and transparency. So, I will keep pushing for sunshine. I will keep doing my duty of oversight and I will do my best to defend this freedom that you and I enjoy and have a right to. Thank you.
Senator, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of presenting not one, but two Defender of Freedom Awards this year. Senator, your exceptional leadership in investigating the Fast and Furious scandal makes you a most worthy recipient of this award. You've been an invaluable ally to NRA's team on Capitol Hill over the years, and your steadfast courage in exposing this scandal has helped restore the sacred trust that we, the people, deserve to have in our government. So on behalf of all of us, I hope you'll accept this award as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Of course I will.
Thank you.